So I'm really, really happy to have Mark, Alex, and Christine here. All of them have spoken in the past 3 weeks. Mark was speaking on how can we make sure that people who step up and do the right thing when it's time, that those people get supported and that those people get pointed out, and how can we make it easier for those people to step up and do the right thing. He had a really great idea on a legal defense fund for folks who have gone out of their way to do the right thing, even if it was an illegal gray area. We had Alex Gladstein on as well from the Human Rights Foundation. We had him on even twice. Thanks for joining twice. That was quite fantastic. Once in the first 5 weeks of the Sanity Preserver on COVID-19 and authoritarianism. And then in last week's salon, we had him on strengthen communities. I'm going to post all of the videos here in the chat if you want to follow up on them. And then lastly, Christine was on in a different function doing the Hivemind. She was on when we talked about how can we invest and how can we donate and kind of accelerate philanthropy for high impact science and technology development right now. So thank you all for joining. Thank you for joining for the deep dive week of the Hivemind. I don't even want to take very much time away. Maybe to kind of like pick any threads up that I haven't touched on yet. Maybe do you want to kind of like very quickly say a few words, introduce yourself, in your relationship to the topic that we're going to be discussing today, which is human rights security from post-COVID-19. Maybe, if you want to give a little bit of like a 1 minute fill in to what to think that you want to start. Mark, you are unmuted, so you can speak.
Okay. So the thing that I'll just revisit some themes that from earlier sessions, just for people here. The thing that stands out to me in examining how our society responded to COVID-19, in particular how it failed to respond, especially the lack of early testing. What stood out to me was a cultural difference between what I experienced in the world of software engineering and what I was hearing from people in the medical industry. And the difference is what I call the culture of permission. In the software engineering industry, what I'm used to, what I see other people doing, is very much you see something that needs doing, you do it. You write code, you put things out there, open source, so there's other eyeballs. You appeal to the decentralized community of expertise to evaluate and spread the word about which things are worth using and which things are reliable, etc. In the medical industry, there's this pervasive inhibition of just doing things, or rather, there's all of these official licensing agencies, the FDA, the CDC, and people ask permission before they do what's necessary, even when lives are at stake. And we saw this with testing. Several institutions that were able to test did not test because they were denied permission to test. We found out about the transmission in Washington State because after being denied, somebody there went ahead and tested anyway. And without that, we would not have known that there was community transmission of COVID in Washington State at the time that we did. We now see this flowering of DIY efforts at mass production, DIY efforts at ventilators, of people doing jailbreaks on BiPAP machines, because BiPAP machines have a lot of the ingredients you need for a respirator if you can reprogram them. I'm sorry, a ventilator if you can reprogram them. As Allison mentioned, in the short term, I think trying to figure out how to defend the people who are in the gray area where they just go ahead and do DIY efforts and save lives without asking permission. We want to let them know we've got their back. But longer term, I think that we need to realize that the main reason for the cultural difference that I very much jumped out at me in talking to people is that as a software engineering professional, I do not have a license to practice software engineering. Without a license, I'm still at the top of my field. I'm a respected professional. But because I can do that without a license, no matter who I piss off, they cannot take my license away from me. For decades, I have seen controversies on both sides, pro and con licensing, and I formed my own opinions on that. But it wasn't until COVID that I realized that the main problem with licensing is the threat of license withdrawal makes people obedient. And a population in which the only experts that are allowed to practice their expertise are doing so under conditions that make them obedient to official truths is a society that cannot discover controversial truths, or is at least tremendously inhibited from doing so. So I want to point out that all of these licensing systems that we've got have their sense of legitimacy from the population because of the time in which we had a plague of quacks and snake oil in a very, very information poor environment. The information environment in which we decided that those institutions were legitimate and needed is one in which the population at large was incredibly information poor. Our informational situation, our ability to, in a decentralized manner, recognize expertise, recognize good ideas, discuss things, argue things, etc., is completely different than it was then. So the issue about whether experts should need licenses to operate, whether drugs and medical devices should need permission to be distributed, that whole issue should be examined afresh, taking into account our decentralized ability to credibly examine things for reliability versus the functioning and dysfunction that we have seen of official channels of truths.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's, that's a really good practical thread to pull on. I also, before we kind of like dive deeper into this, I want to hear from Alex too, especially because Alex and the Human Rights Foundation, they just had a fantastic conference, COVID-Con, which was basically about the relationship between authoritarianism and COVID-19. So I'd love to hear from you, like specifically, like your kind of like your biggest worries about threats to human rights and civil liberties that are arising from COVID-19, and especially perhaps like which places are you most worried about, and which human rights or liberties are you most worried about, and why do they matter at all, and why aren't we defend them right now? Yes, Alex, feel free to unmute yourself.
Cool. Hey, thanks everyone. Thanks for having me. I'll just riff off what Mark was saying with regard to, I guess, this idea of permissionlessness and how important it's going to be, because we have all kinds of authorities that are abusing their power in around the world that we've seen. And a lot of the tools that people are going to use to protect themselves in the coming years and decades, I think, are going to be open source software. are going to be protocols that, can be launched without having to ask permission from anybody. Because in many cases, these authorities are not going to want to liberate. Rather, they're going to want to control in a more tight fashion. Obviously, we're seeing an extreme version of this in dictatorships like in China, for instance, where the government has a very high censorship environment, has probably the most aggressive, expansive experiment in social engineering and censorship in human history, all reliant on highly centralized technology that like vacuums up all of your information into a cloud, and then it can be analyzed with big data, AI, algorithms, etc. What is a necessary counterbalance to that kind of trend, I would say, which is certainly a trend in I would say all societies, just at different speeds and in different directions, would be kind of like, it's almost like asymmetric warfare. It's like technology that's very cheap for us to use, but very difficult to attack. And that all comes from encryption. So this idea that the Chinese government may be able to, you even saw today, there was some news with regard to the FBI getting really angry that Apple wouldn't cooperate with them and help break the encryption on their phones in the case of a crime in Florida. This was sort of like a front page news in the tech industry today. I think you're going to see governments raging against the machine of encryption, but there's not a whole lot they can do, if they don't have the private key for a system that they can't break. So it really gives citizens an extraordinary power. And this, I think, manifests in two areas most immediately that's really going to help us, regardless of where we live or what country we live in. And that's communications and finance. And in communications, having, built on PGP to obtain pretty good privacy through apps like Signal, for example, is humongously important. And even though the usability is not as nice or comfortable or convenient as something like a Slack or a WeChat or something like that, it's still pretty amazing that we can have that. And I know these systems aren't perfect. I know Signal's tied to your phone number. We'll see if they can break past that. And there are other options out there too. But this idea of these open source peer-to-peer encrypted chat apps are a huge tool to protect our human rights and privacy moving forward. The other, of course, would be finance, and that's why I spend a lot of time thinking about and advocating for Bitcoin as a very important check or challenge to the state's power. In a lot of these governments, the regimes are able to abuse and exploit the people and abuse the powers that they have at their disposal because they can control the economy, and then they can sort of control the printing press. And this is not as widely discussed in the West, I guess, but in dictatorships, it's really obvious in places like Turkey, for example, where the leader Erdogan, abuses his financial powers in a almost bizarre way, preventing people from doing foreign exchange. His vice president was once caught with a money printer in his basement. I mean, can you imagine that? So some of these regimes are just, they run roughshod over the idea of having kind of like a stable economy that's sort of fair for everybody. So especially for these billions of people out there, the idea that they could opt out or escape into a permissionless financial system that's equal for everybody around the world, no matter how rich you are, you can't stop anybody else from using it, is a very powerful idea. And you're starting to see people in these regimes use Bitcoin as either like a bridge between money to move money back and forth, or just as like this sort of permissionless, confiscation resistant, censorship resistant store of value. So I know it's daunting, and I know governments are using the threat of COVID and, to expand their powers and to create new permanent, temporary states of emergency. But I do think some of this open source software is really going to give individuals an edge, and it gives me something to be a little bit optimistic about.
Very nice. Yeah, I think again, a nice book from Mark and a lot of threads to pull on there. Maybe like Christine, you'd also like to make an opening statement. I think you can unmute yourself.
Sure, Allison. So Mark comes at this as a as an innovator and technologist, and Alex as a human rights activist, I almost come at it more as just a typical user and a citizen. And this whole issue of human rights and civil liberties has obviously been one that both Foresight and other organizations in based in the Bay Area, especially, of course, Electronic Frontier Foundation, have been focused on for decades now. But I have to admit that as an individual, I never and this was John Gilmore was the leader, one of the leaders at EFF that was always on this issue about the dangers of surveillance. And I was pretty naive for a long time. And although I knew he was right, I didn't seem super urgent. Because after all, it just wasn't clear to me what was going to be the mechanism by which this is going to affect people like me, for example. But then over the decades, he convinced me that, look, this data, when it's gathered, it is always abused eventually. Sooner or later, the data will be abused. It will be abused to control people. And as we've watched in certain countries, certainly the US, but more so elsewhere, the rise of surveillance and the use of it to control populations, it's just become super clear that he's completely right, to the extent even that I'm feeling a personal chilling effect myself. Those of you who are connected to me on Facebook, which is quite a few of you, and you're all welcome to join me there. I post about human rights and civil liberties and call out abuses. And it's gotten to the point where I realize this could be used against me someday. And when that thought comes up, I think, well, the fact that I thought that means I have to post it now, right? I can't back down. I have to go forward. But I'm not sure everyone thinks that way, right? Because there's a potential personal cost coming in the future from this. So this has just made me realize, oh my God, it's here. This novel 1984, it was supposed to be a warning, not a roadmap. And yet here we are, right? So we've seen this coming for a long time. It's just getting worse and worse. And of course, COVID-19 has really added to that. So I'm thrilled to be here with Mark and Alex and Allison to explore these issues. And of course, with our audience as well. We've got a lot of people with some important ideas out there.
Awesome, thank you. I think one of the things that I think COVID definitely did is that it brought home a lot of the things that we are worried about in theory, in other countries, in the future, like right in front of our doorsteps, right? This is, for example, one in terms of donations, how easy is it to kind of like have a quali for your dollar that was usually in other, in other countries, right? Donations aren't usually to go there. Now you suddenly see that, people right in front of your doorsteps can be helped, are in incredible distress. But it also goes the same for, all of the kind of civil liberties and all the human rights that we're always worried about, but mostly worried about in countries like Venezuela and so on and so forth. Suddenly, this is all coming right in front of our doorstep. And I think one of the quotes that I really love from Alex in the little book of Bitcoin, I think it was that, he was quoting Taleb, who was saying, well, crypto commerce and the tools in it can be really an insurance against an Orwellian future. And little did we know that was, not really a future that was very long term, but it's right in front of our doorsteps. So I welcome all of you to kind of unmute yourselves and to just have an open conversation. I definitely only want to chime in if it's necessary, or if I want to pull on a new thread. But for now, I would love to see, you've already kind of mentioned a few of those tools, but what are ways in which people on this call, but also people generally, what are a few tools in which that you'd recommend people use to kind of protect their privacy, protect their liberties, personally at home, on their computers, but also kind of tools on which we could, which still need some tinkering until they can be released in the public. Are there specific things you want to point out? Maybe Mark, you'd like to go first?
Sure. So I want to expand on the cryptography theme here well beyond cryptocurrency. The thing that's most visible when people think about crypto commerce, the cryptographically enabled commerce, are the cryptocurrencies. But to me, the really important thing is the smart contracting. There's this, going back to John Gilmore, there's this wonderful phrase from him from decades ago, which is, the internet protocols see censorship as damage and roots around it. For all of the lobbying that we've done to protect the First Amendment, to protect free speech, the thing that has given us the most free speech and the most secure free speech against further threats has been the emergence of the web and modern cryptography. With smart contracting, we have an ability to create voluntary, rule-based, law-like arrangements that are not rooted in jurisdictions or not rooted in jurisdictional law, but bring back many of the benefits of the rule of law, while the jurisdictional systems seem to have lost the rule of law in large measure. And these things providing the right contract in large measure can see attempts to interfere with that as damage that they root around. There's this concept called regulatory arbitrage, where you basically shop for a jurisdiction with less interference. One way to think about what a blockchain does is it's doing automated regulatory arbitrage block by block. Any country that tries to shut down participation in a blockchain within their country simply, if they succeed, simply causes that country to no longer participate. The blockchain as a whole simply proceeds as if not, without any damage at all, proceeds preserving its integrity. If we can, so smart contracting is about extending that form of rule of law, of reliable integrity that survives interference, from simple cryptocurrencies into complex voluntary cooperative arrangements that can let us build a new world of governance that is suitable for the online world we now find ourselves in. In the online world that we've suddenly been thrust into by COVID, we find that as knowledge workers, we're all equidistant from each other. Suddenly, the geographic boundaries have completely dissolved into irrelevance as we interact with each other. So we need a new way to create systems of rule of law, systems of government, cooperative arrangements suitable for this new world we've been thrust into.
Who would like to chime in? Alex, Christine?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the one issue that, or the one problem that I guess a lot of folks probably share or also have is how to differentiate buzzwords from real progress. I mean, smart contract is a decades old idea. Obviously, there are smart contracts in Bitcoin, for example. But the word has been used so relentlessly by scam artists. It's brutal. So the same thing with the term blockchain. They both have been so milked for their idea by people who all they want to do is take your money, that the industry has become extremely cloudy, and there's just very, very little to show. However, there are some cool projects if you know how to dig deep enough. I'm wearing a hat of an open source software project called BTC Pay Server that I thought I would tell you a little bit about. I think it's really great. Basically, a lot of people if they wanted to accept Bitcoin as an e-commerce on their website, as a merchant, or even if they wanted to accept donations, they would use this thing called BitPay. So BitPay is like a centralized payment processor that can link your incoming Bitcoin to fiat off ramps, etc. And the problem with BitPay is that some organizations were basically governments were putting pressure on BitPay to not allow certain transactions, which obviously goes against the whole spirit of Bitcoin. So this manifested itself most recently last summer in Hong Kong, where in fact a really important journalist outlet called Hong Kong Free Press was using BitPay, and then BitPay stopped allowing them to access their funds, which was really shocking. So there's this programmer named Nicolas Dorier who kind of, in 2017, he says, I'm going to make BitPay obsolete. It's like, he just tweets this out there and everybody's like, okay, we'll see what happens. So he basically just copies the code of BitPay in a certain way and releases as an open source platform called BTC Pay Server, which is now such an impressive project and is something that I'm certainly a big supporter of, and we use at the Human Rights Foundation. And it's just a way for you to basically run sell things or receive donations online without exposing. There's no collection of data. Like there's no central server collecting anything. There's no third party that can stop a transaction, and it has a high degree of privacy. There's no address reuse. It creates unique invoices. You can even use things like privacy boosting technologies like PayJoin or Lightning in conjunction with it. It's such an impressive project, and just a handful of people are working on it. But like some companies like Square have given grants to help it out. But I really think this is the future in many ways of some of these, at least in donations and payments. There's going to be a lot of these open source projects that gain steam, and there are some diamonds in the rough. But man, the industry just as a whole is so brutal. So just be careful and do your homework.
All right, thanks, Christine.
Yeah. One of the comments in the chat is by Ted Howard, and he's making the point that, all right, given that if surveillance data is going to be collected, who has access to that data? And this is a key question, of course. If the data is only held by the central authorities, then, and it's held in secret, and we don't know what's in there, then it's pretty easy to use that to control whoever's misbehaving in their view, right? And this point is famously made by David Brin, the author who writes a lot of science fiction, but also wrote the book, The Transparent Society, where he makes this point and says, you can tell from the title of the book, he's advocating for what Ted is advocating for in the chat, which is, well, if you're going to collect data, you'd better share it with everybody. We want to, if you're going to collect data about me, I want to collect data about whoever's collecting my data, right? I want to know what they're up to, which is a fair point. But the question then, we revert again to the Electronic Frontier Foundation and John Gilmore's arguments, who argues pretty passionately against what David's arguing for. And they're both really smart guys. So what's happening here? John feels that privacy is important and that a fully transparent society isn't the way to go. Now, I know, Mark Miller, that you are familiar with, at least in theory, a way to treat surveillance data responsibly, but not just disclose it 100%. So in theory, perhaps we can have the best of both worlds where we prevent crimes, but we don't have this stuff used against us. And I wonder, Mark, if you could just sketch out how, at least in theory, this would work.
So I want to not overpromise here. This is a direction to look for solutions. We're very far from actually knowing of practical solutions to the problem as a whole. But some precedents that that I think we should take a look at. the thin thread program done by, remind me of the guy's name who's at NSA at the time?
I'm not the one to ask.
Binny.
Oh, what?
Binny.
Oh,
Binny.
yes, Binny. Binny at NSA. After 9/11, he put together a program called Thin Thread, which was still way too centralized for anything that I'd like to see for the modern world, and way too dangerous. But the idea of it was that the information was not revealed to the analysts at the NSA in an uncontrolled manner, and that there were auditing safeguards on the access to that. We've lately seen in the UK, the running of data analysis algorithms arranged to where the algorithms run where the data is, where their queries against the database get audited and reviewed, and the raw data itself never leaves the site where it is. We've seen with the current controversy over the Apple-Google contact tracing app, that they're trying to engineer something that is privacy preserving to the maximal extent while still providing useful abilities to track down exposure to COVID from one person to another. And we've seen pushbacks against that by those who want to use COVID as an excuse to centralize collection of information about people, including a really stupid editorial in the Washington Post claiming that the Apple-Google approach is useless because it doesn't give central authorities access to location data. The Apple-Google approach is based on the fact that you don't need the location data in order to inform people they've been exposed. So these are all nice precedents. Another very nice precedent that I think goes more to the core question that Christine is raising is David Chaum's original DigiCache system, again, was centralized in a way that we would not want in the modern world, but had this weird feature to it that we should look to, which is as long as a participant was participating honestly, their identity was strongly untraceable. But if they double spent, then the act of double spending, the act of behaving dishonestly, also enabled their identity to be revealed. So the identity was built into the cryptography that the identity was strongly hidden as long as you were behaving properly. So these are the set of things, and then the underlying cryptographic tools that I would turn to in the modern world are zero-knowledge proofs and multi-party secure computation, which are both kind of almost magical ingredients in terms of their power, but they're very hard to. They're not practical for general purpose computation at this point. And there's this continual research of figuring out how to extend them into more and more special cases.
Yeah, I think in the talk that I posted that you, Christine, and I did on intelligent voluntary cooperation versus top-down control to handle crises, we go also a little bit into some of the tools that we could be using for decentralized and privacy-preserving ways of doing something like a multipolar enforcement regime that keeps everyone safe, which is kind of like I guess, builds both on Brin's surveillance and it also builds on the thin thread by Binny. So if you're interested, watch that video. Also, we're writing a book on that at the moment. It's not out yet, but the first draft is ready. So we may have something to show very soon. Thank you for mentioning those two tools. I will post an article that was actually written by Ben Garfinkel. It's not an article, it's a very long paper, which explains both zero-knowledge proofs and multi-party computation in a really fantastic way. It's a history of the last 30 years of cryptography, and it's really quite good. I want to call on Christopher Rasch, who has been really posting quite vicariously a few of the other points that we could point to in the world of crypto commerce, a few of the tools that, because he disagrees with the fact that we have not very much to show. So Christopher, what do we have to show? I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. I just wanted to follow up on Alex's post and point to a few other technologies that I think are helpful for working around government efforts to censor and shut down businesses that they don't like. So I just posted a link to the chat if you want to take a look at some of them. Like as some of you may know, YouTube has started to censor medical professionals who promote a line that YouTube does not agree with. And so some of those people have started posting their videos to YouTube, to a YouTube alternative called Library. And Library has a coin called LBRY, which you can use to pay for hosting and to boost your rankings within the Library network. But you don't have to use Library, the company, to use the coin. You can connect to the network completely independently of them, and there's nothing that their developers can do to stop you from participating. There's another project called SIA, which allows for decentralized storage, similar to Amazon. And built on top of that is a service called Filebase, which offers the same API as the Amazon Web Service to the SIA network. Again, no one can stop you from participating in these networks, not even the company that created the software, unlike Amazon, which can shut down your web service at any time if they so choose. Similar to BitPay Server, there's also a company called OpenBazaar that offers a Amazon network where you can buy and sell things. Again, decentralized in a decentralized manner, using a variety of cryptocurrencies. And finally, there's a network called LokiNet, which offers an incentivized onion network, which offers better censorship resistance and better quality of control, quality of service than is currently available from Tor. So anyway, I just wanted to point out that there are a bunch of other products that have come out of the blockchain space that are functional and getting better all the time. So I don't think it's been, while there are certainly a lot of scams and projects that are unlikely to succeed, there have also been a lot of other things that have come out of it that I think are quite valuable.
Great. Does anyone of the panelists want to chime in?
Yeah,
Yes.
I think that's a good point. At the end of the day, though, what we need is an alignment between business and businesses that have tons of users and privacy technology. And I'll just draw people's attention to one possibility that could be a huge game changer in the next couple of years. So obviously, I'm sure most of you know of the company Square. They have a very significant percentage of point of sale equipment in the United States, especially for small businesses, but also for large ones. They're pretty pretty competitive and dominant in that area. I know there's a lot of competition, but let's just say obviously they're one of the big fish there. They've created so first of all, they took a risk and they became the first publicly traded company in the United States to allow users to buy Bitcoin using the Cash app, which is a really terrific app, I would say. The way they've done it's very smart, very conservative, and it's how they're making their money right now. If you actually look at their earnings calls, it's pretty interesting. But they've decided to create a nonprofit organization called Square Crypto, which is supposed to be sort of autonomous, which is supposed to do research and development, completely like disconnected from, or at least they say, from their corporate interests. Let's say they just want to give back and allow scientists to be able to work on what they want to work on, with a little more funding than what might exist out there. And what Square Crypto is working on with a team of really, really top minds, I would say, is this technology called Lightning. And they're trying to create basically a common interface for Lightning developers and people wanting to build Lightning wallets and Lightning ecosystem to kind of have a better set of standards. And this to me is really, really important because it points to a potential future in the near future where like anyone using Square technology might be able to enable Lightning transactions. So what this would mean is that you could like pay for your coffee or something on the internet or buy something anywhere where Square is accepted, potentially. I mean, this very much could happen with essentially a extremely private, fast, and final settlement version of Bitcoin. Lightning is a second layer technology that sits on top of Bitcoin. You can kind of think of it almost as the credit card equivalent to paper money. It makes some trade-offs in security. It's not as secure as Bitcoin, but it's actually more private. And this would be pretty exciting. So I think this is really important because at the end of the day, if we want to shrink the surveillance state, along the mission of, I think, this conversation, one of the key areas to do that is payments. That's where a lot of information about us has been revealed to the surveillance state or to surveillance capitalism, whichever beast you don't like, or maybe you don't like either of them. But a lot of what we've revealed and a lot of the data we've exposed to third parties has been through payments and transactions. It's one of the things that we do every day, all of us do every day. And if you just think about it very simply, we used to pay with paper money. And when you'd buy something with paper money, a lot of you still do, of course. Cash is king. I'm a big cash advocate. But a lot of people around the world don't use it anymore. And when you buy something with paper money, you don't reveal anything about yourself, like your name, your address, your last purchase, your phone number, nothing. And that was okay, technically and morally and legally. That precedent was like we were all good. That was fine. But now we're like on-ramping towards, of course, not just credit cards, but using our phones, wearables, and eventually probably chips under our skin to buy stuff. And we're going to be revealing, you have to look at what you reveal when you do that. It's a huge constellation of information about yourself. So to me, it's very important we create digital solutions that reveal a bare minimum about ourselves. And I'm a strong believer that the Bitcoin Lightning stack, if popularized, for business reasons, like you'd want to use Bitcoin Lightning, there are real reasons. It's not just that you want to be private. I don't think that would ever succeed. But that the fact is it could be faster and cheaper and more convenient for people to actually use it. So it gives me some hope there. And it's certainly a project I'd hope you all should check out.
Thanks. Do you want to chime in, Mark or Christine?
Sure. So Allison, you sent us a list of questions to prepare for this and asked some really good ones. One was, what would it take to get computer security right? And just speaking as a user, I think the way to come at that is to say, well, what did it take to get physical security right? How do we keep unfriendly strangers out of our homes? And of course, the first thing we do is we put locks on the doors and windows. But if you think of everything that we need to do to keep a home secure, it's an immense number of things. It's everything from having a national military and a police force, home security alarms, training the children, who's allowed to get into the house. I mean, it's a huge number of things it takes to get physical security right, even for a single home. So this answer of what would it take to get computer security right is it's a very complex, multi-layered thing. But before we get off this call, I want to throw it to Mark to talk about, hey, we could at least lock the doors. But before we jump to Mark, another question you asked, Allison, was how has this issue of computer security changed globally? And I just wanted to mention that for those of you who are of my generation, the boomers, we can recall not too long ago when the theory about countries that were coming up and that were perhaps authoritarian in their developing stage, that when personal incomes reached a certain level, it was about, if I recall, about $8,000 per person, that the people, the citizens of that country would demand change, and that change would gradually occur, and that as countries got richer, they would naturally become democratic and have human rights and all these things. But you know, this growth in technological surveillance seems to have thrown a wrench into that process. I mean, maybe that was never correct, but it was plausible. It seemed reasonable at the time. But if you look, for example, at China, they're getting so good at this social control via surveillance. They're getting really, really good at it. So this whole theory that, gee, you know, let's get everybody rich and then they'll be free, it may not be working out, which makes this whole question of computer security super critical, because now our physical security, no matter where we are in the world, is dependent increasingly on our computer security. So I wanted to throw that back to Mark and say, Mark, how do we put locks on the doors?
So thank you. I want to, all analogies are dangerous. So as we derive insights from the analogies, we have to reason by analogies, but we should also be aware of the ways in which they can mislead us. The physical world and the software world are very different in some important regards that's important to understand, so that we don't move too much of our physical world security intuitions into software. So in the physical world, you can't build an impenetrable wall. You can build boundaries that resist penetration force more and more. You can build safes that are harder to crack, but you can't build a perfect safe. And whereas in the software world, perfect impenetrable boundaries are cheap and pervasive. The computer security problem is that when we go beyond simple isolation to cooperative interaction across the boundary, which we always do, then if we don't have an architecture, we can confuse ourselves. So in the physical world, the danger is you're always in danger of greater effort by the attacker. In the software world, if you're doing computer security right, once you get close to doing it right, then the major danger is that you didn't quite do it right. You confused yourself. You have a hole in your architecture, and then the attacker can get in. And it's not that it's greater effort by the attacker can always overcome any defense. Perfect defenses are achievable. Perfect confidence in your perfect defense is not achievable. You never know 100% anything. But SEL4, for example, might be perfect at the security claims that it makes, in which case it can defend against an arbitrarily clever attacker with regard to the threat models that it claims to defend against. So the problem is that these architectures are somewhat expensive to build. Building software in a sloppy manner will always be cheaper than building it in a careful, high-quality manner. And so the issue of market incentives comes to play. Most software has been developed in a under time to market pressure, in which insecure crap that gets to market faster often dominates. The other thing that's interesting about this new world of crypto commerce is if you make a mistake, hundreds of millions of dollars can disappear overnight with no recourse. And that means that the insecure software dies quickly, so you have an ecosystem of the survivors of this tremendous selection pressure to be secure. And the people providing software that survives in that space understand that. So for the first time, humanity has a chance of building a tech stack down from the foundations all the way up to the users under market pressures to actually build it well, while the modern practices of computer security at the endpoints with precedents like SEL4 and on the network with modern cryptography enable us to try to do it perfectly. We now also have a tech stack where we have market pressures to try to do it perfectly. So we have a chance at building something that can survive severe attack.
Thank you. Okay, I want to give time for questions from the audience as well. And I think David Grosof had quite a long one. I just posted a talk on your points that we once did a while ago on civilization as irrelevant superintelligence and why computer security, if we get it right, may also potentially protect us from ever increasing intelligences. And so that it's in theory, and that it should in theory be protective on the long run. So if people want to follow up, I welcome you to check out that talk. Also, if you are interested in more on this, we definitely go into more depth in the book that Christine, Mark, and I are writing. And if you're interested in joining that like pre-group on where we do readings on the book drafts, then email me at a@foresight.org to be added to that pod. And I want to give the time for David to ask his quite eloquent question. I'm going to unmute you now, David. I hope that's okay.
Okay. So you can read the longer version of the justification for it. But the idea is that markets are wonderful things, but they have failures. They have ways of failing. And one of the ways that markets fail is around things that seem to be good but aren't and are really cheap to make. So I found a sort of inconsistency between what Mark said about, we have a more transparent medical system now, so snake oil might not be so effective. And then a moment later, we're talking about how confusing and complicated the market is for Bitcoin solutions and smart contracts. So my view is if it's cheap and easy to crank out garbage, you'll get more garbage. If there's not a way to exclude garbage, if there's not a way to pull the weeds out, if there's not a way to attach a penalty or a cost to throwing garbage into a good space, you'll get a lot of garbage. And I'm wondering whether people are concerned who know much, much more about this than I do, about whether solutions for transparency, for decentralization, for blockchain, for privacy preserving are just as subject to snake oil and silliness as health supplements, which I've mentioned several times here as my bête noire.
So the growth of skepticism that defends against snake oil is a growth under feedback. It's a form of the system learning. And when the system starts out, there will be a lot of snake oil, and there will be, unfortunately, a lot of people who fall for it. And we've certainly seen that in the crypto commerce space. There were lots, and once the cryptocurrencies started zooming up, and there were a lot of ICOs, a lot of scammers entered the market. There were a lot of what people refer to as shitcoins. One of the things about bubbles is while everything's going up, people become extremely uncritical. But at this point, enough of those have crashed that many people, not all people, but altogether, the system of decentralized judging of these things has been learning to apply harder criteria, has been learning to judge things more skeptically. Much of the money getting invested has been learning to invest more skeptically and with better criteria. And this kind of process is iterative. And one of the things, this is another issue of architecture, is I was at Project Xanadu, which was a hypertext project before the web. And at Xanadu, we were very much inspired by Popper's explanation of sort of the logic of scientific skepticism, scientific discovery and selection, where appealing ideas are actually wrong eventually get weeded out, and unappealing ideas, which are actually right, eventually rise to the surface. What we need to come back to in the context of our social media and our written media, is better representation and visualization of argument. Wikipedia is amazing at showing overall consensus truth, but it does an amazing job actually of fairly representing controversial argument, but it wasn't built to represent argument. What we all need are better information architectures to navigate accumulated in-depth argument, to be able to better leverage the expertise of people in those arguments as judged by other people with emergent expertise, of decentralized endorsement systems that kind of follow the logic of the propagation of weights that Google's original PageRank took into account. There's real insight there in terms of propagation of credibility weights, but it needs to be rooted in the diverse subjective judgments of what the priors are on that credibility, which will differ from person to person. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot we can do in information architectures so that our decentralized judging can compose better into overall skepticism and make us a more effective decentralized scientific community following Popper's logic.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, Adele was just pointing out Jamie Joyce, who's in this community, she's on Slack as well, who's doing a society library, which is kind of like a mapping graph of arguments. She originally focused on climate and is now focusing on COVID-19. So that's one of the issues that is currently, I think, being explored. And then we have actually a Foresight Salon with Ted Nelson from Project Xanadu on the Xanadu follow-up, which I can post here as well. But then, there are a few of those of those mechanisms. And tomorrow we're actually going to have a discussion about sense making, in which a few people will share kind of current efforts that they're working on to help society make better sense. Thank you for that. Okay, so I would love to just do an official closing out. I think I've messaged the speakers privately if they're able to stay on, but I don't want to assume that. So I'm going to say an official goodbye for now. Thank you for staying 5 minutes over. I really, really, really appreciate it. So feel free from now on to drop off at any time. I thought this was super valuable. I took notes the whole time on different tools that I want to follow up on. And I will be sharing them in the follow-up as well, so everyone can check those out and see if some stick. So thanks. This is an official goodbye from my end now. Thank you so much. And for those who want to stay on, what I would love to do next is maybe ask some of the participants, to share, given the fact that we have so many of you here who could actually be on a panel. Please share with us what are kind of tools that you find super valuable right now, both in terms of tools that allow you to cooperate in better decentralized ways, tools that you think you trust to be preserving your privacy, like any tools that you'd like other participants on this chat to explore moving forward. That would be, I think, one thing that I'd love to hear from all of you. And I put on the gallery review for now, so please raise your hand or message me in the chat if you have a specific tool that you'd like to shout out, and just like Adele did with Society Library. Okay, and until I'm still collecting, I would love to, I think Anita has a question to ask. So let's see which of the panelists will still be around. And Anita, I'm going to unmute you next. If you have a question instead, then as the participants, as the panelists are still here, feel free to go for it. Maybe they'll drop off in the meanwhile, but for now, I'll unmute Anita.
All right, great. Thank you, Allison. Thanks, everyone. It's an amazing, amazing conversation. My question, or rather thought, I would really want to hear your perspective on that is, a lot of the time we're always debating between centralized, decentralized, centralized, decentralized. There's no such thing as 100%. There are benefits of decentralization. There are also benefits of centralization. Especially during COVID, we've seen countries on their responsiveness to attacking a virus in a centralized, cohesive manner was super effective in saving lives. At the end of the day, governance is about ensuring that all citizens, that everybody is benefiting from this greater good as a mechanism. But of course, political motivations kind of change the course of that. So from a privacy perspective, should the de facto even be about all private and prohibit as much as possible and then give individual freedom? And then what does really freedom mean? I would rather make everything more transparent, but then how do you protect and build controls to protect the vulnerable? Because it's all about abusing, right? I mean, if everything is open, there could be abuse of how that could be utilized for both monetary benefit, for war situations, to like several others, negative scenarios. But should the de facto even be about privacy? What if, like, when we talk about open source and we talk about privacy, it kind of oxymoronic in some sense for me, using those two, terms in the same sentence. So really want to know the construct, the core construct about the hybridization versus this extreme one or the other. And either we all go towards one or all go towards the other. And then it's always a constant battle. So I would really love to hear some of your perspectives on that. Thank you.
Well, the reason that, I admitted up front that I originally came from a very naive perspective and had to be kind of beaten into submission in a way, mostly by John Gilmore on this privacy thing and why it's important. So I totally hear where you're coming from, really, I totally do. The reason I think that you hear so much emphasis on privacy by people who are paying attention to this issue is that I think the technological natural pathway is toward complete surveillance and toward having the vast majority of that data be in the hands of a centralized authority, which may or may not be democratic, may or may not be something that we can change if we're not happy with it. So there's this technological push that pushes in that direction. So if we want to have any kind of balance, which I think maybe you're calling for a balance here, that's why we have to kind of think really hard about, well, how do you get a balance? Now, is there a conflict between privacy and the term open source? I think you have to understand how we're using that term open source. Usually, we're not referring to the data. We're referring to the software code that's manipulating the data. That's what's open, okay? So in open source, the code is open, which means you can tell what it's doing. And what that means for an individual is, in theory, if you want to learn computer science, you can tell what that code is doing with your data. So open source in that sense is a push for privacy. And so I think you get my point, which is technology pushes one direction. That's why there has to be some kind of pushback if we want to have an appropriate balance between these two different forces. Maybe Mark or someone else would like to take a shot at a different style of explanation, but that's how I think about it.
Alex, Mark, anything to add?
Yeah, I want to, there's several different dimensions in which we can talk about a system being centralized or decentralized. And there's a perspective that we can usefully bring once we've made these distinctions, the perspective of what's called polycentrism that primarily comes from the Ostroms. So the distinction I want to make, the best illustration of the distinction is the Ethereum blockchain, where it's decentralized in the sense that the underlying infrastructure is this blockchain that is being run by miners that are spread out over the world that is resistant to the misbehavior of any one miner or any small coalition of miners. So the decentralization there gives you strong incorruptibility, and strong incorruptibility, I think, is just wonderful. Now, there's a way in which Ethereum and really any individual blockchain is very centralized, which is at every step, the entire blockchain has to come to an agreed decision. So there is the scope of decisions. When Ethereum and a lot of the early blockchains was built under the assumption that it would be the only blockchain in the world. You can see that in the nature of the architecture. And if it was, that means the premise was the entire world has to coordinate to come together to make a single decision that applies to the world. Take a system that we're all familiar with, but we don't think about, that is, I think, the best example of something that is completely decentralized in its decision-making is the evolution of language. Evolution of language is a marvelous thing where we each pull and tug on it. Every time we open our mouths and use language, we're pulling and tugging on the meaning of words in various directions. There is no official meaning of words. They change over time, but there's a coherence that comes from the fact that we all try to use words in order to be understood. So we rendezvous in the space of meaning on common words to convey that meaning. The world of markets has things at all ranges of scale of decision-making between those two. And this is where polycentrism comes in. So the polycentric world of the Ostroms is one in which there are many, many, many institutions at many different scales with tremendously different kinds of overlap. And ideally, you want decision-making to happen as locally as possible. Or as locally as appropriate. And sometimes that the appropriate locality will actually be quite non-local, will be quite centralized in the Ethereum sense. It will because there's tremendous benefit to a lot of people coming at a common decision. So this again is an issue of architecture. We want to build architectures that don't force decisions to be more coordinated than they need to be. To the degree to which decisions can be made in a diverse and separate and competitive way, we want to enable that. But we also want to be able to create extended systems of governance where we can get together and make large-scale decisions together when we need to.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Alex, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'll just have a final comment here. I wanted to address something from earlier quickly before I get into the decentralization point. Someone asked about, how do we defeat all the snake oil? What do we do with it? And someone mentioned Gresham's law in the comments, this idea in economics that the bad money drives out the good, that you're obviously not going to want to use the good money because you're going to want to save that. You'd rather use the bad stuff because it's just, there's more of it. It's easier to produce, etc. I think you're actually going to see a Gresham's law break. I think you're going to see a reverse Gresham's law. And I know different people have names for this, but at least in the cryptocurrency space, because all these other cryptocurrencies are they go to zero and they're relatively worthless over time. And yet you continue to see Bitcoin just continue to be strong and stable, and its ecosystem grows, its decentralization grows, its privacy grows, all these different things. So I think that the snake oil will sort of get over time effaced by I think the strength of the Bitcoin community and its global impact. The second topic of decentralization is a great point, and a lot of people are questioning the decentralized approach as they see dictatorships or at least authoritarian regimes seem to do better in some cases as a response to COVID. And I think that's a very important topic to discuss. And my general take is that, first of all, we don't. It's very hard for us to tell how well centralized or authoritarian governments are doing with COVID because they don't permit a free press and they don't permit independent watchdog organizations. So it's really, really difficult for us to double check the numbers that they're giving to the World Health Organization. In general, we're seeing right now a huge outbreak in Russia that the government is trying to cover up, and Russia is not closed enough where they can really censor everything. So they still have some independent voices, and those people are posting things on the internet, and we're watching them happen live, and we're seeing how there's a lot more infections and deaths and cases in Russia than we were led to believe. The same thing to a certain extent in China and elsewhere. So if you actually compare it over time, The Economist did a study looking at democracies, which I would consider to be more decentralized forms of government versus non-democracies or tyrannies, autocracies, etc. And they looked at 60 years of data up to now, looking at epidemics, everything from Zika to Ebola to smallpox. And it is very clear that democracies perform better over time. I mean, it's very, very strong, the correlation. And I think the reason for that is that humans just thrive better in open environments where we can interact, we can innovate, we can cooperate, we can share information. And viruses do better in climates of fear where no one knows, what to do, no one knows what's going on. And I think that's kind of maybe being blurred a little bit right now, but ultimately long-term, I still believe in that. And generally speaking, just to conclude, I think this idea of decentralization is only important in some areas. Obviously you don't want a decentralized fire department. That doesn't make any sense. But there are three big picture civilizational things that I think are really important, or that decentralization makes them better. And that would be politics or governance, if you wish, information and money. So politics, every political system used to be centralized. Then, among many others, this guy Cleisthenes in ancient Greece came up with this idea that we should be ruled by rules, not by rulers. And over time, humans have chipped away on all continents with this idea of let's have decentralized governance. Let's have a competition. Let's have a balance of power. Let's have an executive branch, a judicial branch, a legislative branch. Let's have special interests. Let's have a free media. And they all kind of fight each other. And this is a very healthy thing. And it really produces societies that thrive. If you look at the countries that have the highest per capita patent rates and scientific innovation and highest equality and anything that you'd really care about, peace, all of them are open societies. So that one, I think I'm pretty happy that we've made some progress as humans there. Information is similar. Obviously, information used to be very closed and centralized 2,000 years ago. If you wanted to learn about the world, you had to like get into the Library of Alexandria or something like that. And you had to be a particular class. You had to have money to invest in your education, etc. Today, everybody's got like the entire world's, all the information at their fingertips, and they can have a voice too. So through the printing press and radio, television, and the internet, finally, information has become much more decentralized. The means of production of information have become much more decentralized. And then I think we're at the third precipice, which is money. And I think that over the next 100 years, you're going to see Bitcoin like make money more decentralized, in as much as nobody in particular is going to control the issuance or the supply, or who can have it and who can't, or who gets to change the rules. We're moving from a system whereby there used to be this oligarchy or even a dictatorship in some places who controlled the money, who controlled how much we're going to print and why are we going to print more, when are we going to print more. All of that is going to be in this particular ecosystem, which will coexist, I think, alongside fiat money, government issued money and government issued debt, of course. But we're going to have this other system where there isn't a small group of people in charge and there isn't an oligarchy. And I think that's just tremendously powerful. So it gives me great hope. And I do think that in these three areas, at least, the decentralized model is worth following. So anyway, thank you everybody for today. It was a lot of fun. Hope to be back soon.
Thank you, Alex. Feel free to drop off. I think, one thing that comes to mind is, and we talk about it a little bit in the salon that Mark, Christine, and I did on intelligent voluntary cooperation, but I think, in times where, in times of crisis, at least, or in times when you feel like there is an asymmetric threat in a way where, a small number of actors can cause, like a large amount of suffering for people. And, that's the case for technology potentially, but it's also the case for things like pandemics, right? And it has spread in a way that spread really quite fast from China to across the world, right? Originating, maybe in a really small pod. I think whenever you see something like that, where you see the asymmetry, then kind of like the calls for like top-down control get much stronger, right? You think that the only way to fight this is via like some global coordination mechanism that's usually like in the form of like some world government or something like that. And we've seen them getting stronger also even in academia. But we basically make the point in this book that there is another way, because if you look at what we often don't really discuss is the threats that are arising with the solutions that we're proposing to this. It may seem really easy to propose this kind of like global coordination arm or global governance regime, but there are definitely a lot of different threats that are arising from such an organ as well. On the one hand, you're limiting the intelligence that you can apply to a problem, right? By having like a top-down regime, you definitely don't get that much unstructured information. If you think of competition as a discovery procedure, then just by the fact that you have a competition, by the fact that you have a decentralized system, you're already gaining just much more information, and you're increasing the intelligence that can be applied to a problem. You also, by having more centralized systems, have one single point of failure. I think Robin Hanson has this fantastic post on why a world government can be suicidal. If you think about the fact that if whenever you had a suicidal thought, you would kill yourself, you wouldn't really, or like many people wouldn't really survive very long, right? But we survive in a way because we have many different thoughts that are in this society of mind, I think, as Marvin Minsky would name it, are in continuous cooperation with each other and in continuous conflict with each other. So the fact that if you had a world government, or if you had a top-down regime, that only needs to fail once for the whole system to fail, right? By having more decentralized regimes, you're actually really increasing the resiliency of any type of regime. You also, by having just a centralized arm, really incentivize kind of like the search for world-destroying stuff, because once you have like an entrenched power system, they have a really, as you can tell from history, they have a really strong incentive of staying in power. So you may actually increase the danger that you're exposing the world to. Then there's, there's a million other, I think, host of threats that I could be going through. One is, creating a risk of internal and external abuse by centralizing data, by centralizing power. You definitely, on the one hand, kind of like create this competition for getting in there, which is like why the worst rise to the top. So you're creating this moral hazard by which people who may want to abuse power have a stronger incentive to get into those institutions in the first place. And then also you increase the risk of external abuse in the way where, people that once they centralize data, they could actually kind of like be extorted much easier, right? And I think even you saw that with Google, and I think that's one of the examples that we go through in the book. Even if at Google, you may want to call yourself as one amongst the good guys, so it's okay to have access to that data. You are definitely making yourself vulnerable to extortion to provide that data, either by governments or perhaps potentially by individuals too. And then finally, you create this kind of transition risk that, whenever you're trying to centralize systems, you definitely have other powers that may want to prevent you from centralizing systems. So just by virtue of that fact, you're already creating enemies. So, I think that there's a lot of threats actually with those kind of like top-down systems that are often underexplored. We go through them a little bit in the talk, and we definitely talk a lot more about them in the book. But we also make the case that it's not a two-centered world. It's not either that we have, this total total anarchy by which we are exposed to a variety of different asymmetric threats, or we have this top-down control state. On the other hand, there is a third way. You can have a secure cooperative system in a decentralized manner where different parts control each other in an encrypted and privacy-preserving way. So it's basically the pitch that we're making in the book, and different tools of how we can get there. So I think I very much want to honor your point that it's not just like centralized versus decentralized as this kind of like as this very binary trade-off. There are other ways in which we can do things, and I welcome you to join the discussion in the book if you're interested in it. Okay, well, we have 2 minutes left. Let's see. Paul had a question that he wanted to ask me earlier about a specific service. Paul, can I introduce you? Sorry, can I unmute you and you can ask the question yourself, maybe? Sure. You're unmuted.
Yeah. I wanted to know if anybody had any experience with a software known as Cubes. It's a free and open source security-oriented operating system meant for single-user desktop computers. Okay,
anyone here, raise your hand if you want to.
Has anyone here any experience with Cubes operating system? It's a free and open source security-oriented operating system meant for single-user desktop computers. So I did post that in the chat, and personally, I just wanted to
see. On that. Yeah, I see a hand. Brian, is this your hand? Are you raising your hand for that? I'm going to unmute you now. Let's see.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes. Yes. Hello. So, yeah. So I have used Cubes. So, what's your question? What? I have installed it on a system. Yes.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to know about user experience and your impressions.
So this was quite a while ago. And at the time, it was an operating system that you could install on a USB stick. So it's a full Linux distribution that you can install on a USB stick. And it also contains very, very heavily compartmentalized systems, I would say. So I would say things like networking and things like file systems and things like that are all very, very well separated. And there are very strict permissions that are set for each component. So, and they can't all be run very easily. So when I learned how to use it, it was very difficult, and I think it's changed since. So my impressions of its current state are quite outdated, I think, since maybe 2015 or so.
Yeah, the reason why, go ahead.
No.
The reason why I wanted to ask is because it seems quite interesting, because you can have a session, load an operating system, and then when you're done with the session, just completely destroy everything so there's no trace left behind. So, and you can just completely respawn up an operating system. Like, you know, when we close a web browser, we've got the history and all that sort of thing. It seems like a great opportunity to take advantage of something that you can completely self-destruct and rebuild every session that you use it as far as privacy. That's all.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm definitely going to check that out too. Let's add it to our list of things to follow up with after this meeting. Okay, well, we're now even over the overtime. So thank you all so much for joining. I'm hoping to have you back very soon to do the participant sharing in a more emotionally intelligent way than I am able to do it. I really just like to talk about ideas very much. I apologize to everyone. Maybe I will send around a few prompts that she usually does for reflection as a homework. I can maybe post them in the chat right now so you don't feel like you're missing out on that personal sharing. Let's see. I want to say thank you so much for everyone who came on today. Thank you so much for making it to the session and doing all the things required. Let's see if we can make it easier for others to join in the future without compromising our security here. And yeah, I'm hoping to see many of you tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to have a session on sense making with Kim Osborne and Phoebe Tickell, who were here last week, and everyone really wanted a second round of that. So you're going to get it tomorrow. Please, I hope you join again at 11 a.m. I'm going to send out the link to everyone who signed up on the Google group and on the Eventbrite beforehand so that you know how to join. And I'm going to do a follow-up with all of the things that all the tools and services that we discussed, so others can follow up on them. I thought it's really, really useful, very, very practical. And yeah, thank you for joining, for staying on for so long. I hope you have a very nice day, and I hope to see many of you tomorrow. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Christine. And thanks to all of you for making this discussion super useful. Love you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.